In a small town surrounded by lush green hills and thick forests, life was peaceful and predictable. The streets were lined with charming cottages, and the air always carried the scent of fresh pine. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night, and children played freely in the park until sunset. Everyone knew each other's names, and gossip traveled faster than the wind. But beneath this idyllic surface, there were whispers, rumors of secrets hidden behind closed doors. Daniel Harper had lived in this town for over a decade. A tall man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, he carried an air of quiet authority. His office, tucked between a bakery and a bookstore, bore the simple sign, Daniel Harper, attorney at law. For years, Daniel had defended those who couldn't defend themselves. He took on cases that others avoided: wrongful evictions, custody battles, even disputes over property lines. Though his work often brought him face to face with the darker side of human nature, he still believed in fairness and justice. That belief, however, came at a cost. Over time, Daniel grew weary, his optimism dulled by the weight of countless disappointments. On this particular autumn afternoon, the sky was painted in shades of orange and gold as the sun began its descent. Leaves crunched underfoot as Daniel stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. He adjusted his coat against the crisp breeze and glanced around. The street was unusually quiet, save for the distant laughter of children playing near the park. As he turned to walk toward his car, parked a few yards away, something caught his attention. A faint sound, almost like muffled sobs. At first, Daniel thought it might be his imagination or perhaps the wind rustling through the trees. But then, the sound grew louder, more urgent. Curious, he paused mid-step and scanned the area. From the corner of his eye, he spotted movement, a blur of motion heading straight toward him. Before he could react, a young boy burst into view, running as if his life depended on it. His face was streaked with tears, his clothes disheveled, and his breathing ragged. Daniel instinctively stepped forward, unsure of what to expect. The boy didn't stop until he collided with Daniel, gripping his jacket tightly as though afraid to let go. For a moment, all Daniel could hear was the boy's heavy breathing and choked sobs. Then, through trembling lips, the child spoke 4 words that froze Daniel to his core. "They took my sister." The world seemed to slow down. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Whoever this boy was, whatever had happened, it was clear that something terrible had occurred. And judging by the desperation in the boy's voice, Daniel knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just another case. It was personal now. The boy clung to Daniel's jacket, his small frame shaking uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his face, leaving streaks on his flushed cheeks. His breathing was erratic, and his wide, frightened eyes darted around as if searching for an escape. Daniel knelt down quickly, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. Hey, he said softly, trying to calm him. "It's okay. You're safe now. Just take a deep breath." For a moment, the boy didn't respond. He buried his face into Daniel's coat, sobbing harder. Daniel glanced around, scanning the empty street for any sign of danger or someone who might be chasing the child. But there was no one, just the fading light of dusk casting long shadows across the pavement. The quietness of the town felt almost eerie now, amplifying the urgency in the boy's cries. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boy pulled back slightly, sniffling. "My sister," he stammered, his voice trembling. "They took her. She's gone." Daniel's heart sank. He gently wiped away the boy's tears with his thumb and gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Okay, buddy. Let's figure this out together. What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy managed to say between hiccups. "My name is Ethan." "All right, Ethan. I'm Daniel. Can you tell me what happened? Who took your sister?" Daniel kept his tone calm but firm, knowing how important it was to keep the boy focused. Ethan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to appear. Then, In broken sentences, he began to explain. I was playing outside, just for a little while. Mom says we can't go far, so I stayed close to the house. When I came back, the door was open. And Lily wasn't there. His voice cracked, and fresh tears welled up in his eyes. There were two men. They had suits on. They looked scary. Daniel frowned, his mind racing. Two men in suits. That didn't sound like a random break-in. This was something more calculated, more sinister. Did they say anything, Ethan? Did you hear them talking? Ethan shook his head vigorously. No, they didn't talk to me. But there was a note on the table. It said Mom has to stay quiet or else. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. The situation was worse than he'd initially thought. Whoever these men were, they weren't just burglars. They were sending a message, a threat, and poor Ethan and his family were caught in the middle of it. Where's your mom now? Daniel asked, keeping his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. She's at work, Ethan replied, clutching Daniel's sleeve tightly. She doesn't know yet. I didn't know what to do. I just ran. I saw your office and thought maybe you could help. Daniel exhaled slowly, his thoughts swirling. This was no ordinary case. Helping Ethan meant stepping into dangerous territory, possibly putting himself and Ethan's family at risk. But looking into the boy's tear-streaked face, Daniel knew he couldn't turn away. There was too much at stake. Okay, Ethan, Daniel said finally, standing up and offering the boy his hand. Let's get you somewhere safe first. Then we'll figure out how to find your sister. I promise, we'll do everything we can. Ethan hesitated for a split second before slipping his tiny hand into Daniel's. His grip was surprisingly strong, filled with desperation and hope. As they walked toward Daniel's car, the weight of those 4 words, "They took my sister," echoed in Daniel's mind. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. This case would change everything. Daniel guided Ethan into his car, making sure the boy was comfortable before pulling out of the parking space. The streets were quieter now, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights as night began to settle in. Ethan sat hunched in the passenger seat, clutching a crumpled piece of paper, the note left behind by the mysterious men. His knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly, and his eyes darted nervously toward the windows as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "To a diner down the road," Daniel replied gently, glancing at the boy through the rearview mirror. "We'll grab something warm to drink, and you can tell me everything you remember. Does that sound okay?" Ethan nodded slowly, though his expression remained tense. Daniel could see the fear still lingering in his eyes, but there was also a flicker of trust, a small sign that the boy believed he was in safe hands. That realization weighed heavily on Daniel. He couldn't let Ethan down. The diner was cozy, with checkered floors and booths lined along the walls. A faint smell of coffee and freshly baked pie filled the air. Daniel ordered 2 hot chocolates and slid into a booth across from Ethan. The warmth of the mug seemed to comfort the boy slightly, and after taking a tentative sip, he finally began to speak. "Lily's my little sister," Ethan said softly, staring into his drink. "She's only 6. She likes drawing pictures and playing with her dolls. Mom works 2 jobs, so I try to take care of her when she's not home." His voice cracked, and he paused to wipe his nose with the back of his hand. "I promised Mom I'd always look out for her, but today, I failed." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Ethan, this isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Those men, they're the ones who did this. Right now, what matters is finding Lily and bringing her back safely. Can you tell me more about them? Anything you noticed might help." Ethan thought for a moment, his brow furrowing in concentration. "They wore suits," he said finally. "Black ones. They looked mean, like they didn't belong in our neighborhood. One of them had a tattoo on his neck, a snake or something. And they drove a big black car. It was parked right outside our house. Daniel nodded, committing every detail to memory. Good, Ethan. That's really good. What about the note? Did you read it? Ethan hesitated, then unfolded the crumpled paper and handed it to Daniel. The handwriting was messy, almost hurried, but the message was clear. Stay silent. Wait for instructions. If you talk, she's gone. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read the words. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a calculated threat designed to control Ethan's family. Whoever these men were, they weren't amateurs. They knew exactly how to instill fear and ensure compliance. Do you know anyone who might want to hurt your family, Ethan? Daniel asked carefully, watching the boy's reaction closely. Ethan shook his head vigorously. No, we don't bother anyone. Mom works hard, and we keep to ourselves. I don't understand why they took Lily. Daniel sighed, leaning back in his seat. He believed Ethan. The boy's innocence and confusion were genuine. But that only deepened the mystery. Why target such an ordinary family? What could they possibly have that would interest dangerous people? As they finished their drinks, Daniel made a decision. Ethan, I need you to stay strong. Okay. We're going to find Lily, but we have to be smart about it. First, we'll go back to your house and see if there are any clues. Then, I'll reach out to some people who can help us figure this out. But you need to promise me one thing. You won't tell anyone else about this. Not even your mom. Until we know it's safe. Ethan nodded solemnly, his young face etched with determination. I promise. Just please, bring her back. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. I will, Ethan. I'll do whatever it takes. As they left the diner and headed back to Ethan's house, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger and far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. But one thing was certain. The clock was ticking, and every second counted. Back at Ethan's house, the air felt heavy, charged with an unsettling silence. The front door was still ajar, creaking softly in the evening breeze. Daniel pushed it open cautiously, his senses on high alert. The living room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. Toys lay scattered on the floor, and a half-empty glass of juice sat on the coffee table, an ordinary scene frozen in time, as if waiting for Lily to return. Ethan clung to Daniel's side, his small hand gripping the attorney's sleeve tightly. This is where they were, he whispered, pointing toward the kitchen. His voice was barely audible, but the fear in it was unmistakable. Daniel nodded and moved forward, careful not to disturb anything that might serve as evidence. In the kitchen, the note Ethan had described earlier was still lying on the table, its ominous message glaring up at them. But something else caught Daniel's eye, a faint scuff mark on the wooden floor near the doorway. It looked like the kind of mark made by dragging something heavy, or someone. His stomach churned at the thought. Whoever these men were, they hadn't come here to negotiate or make idle threats. They'd taken Lily without hesitation, leaving behind only traces of their presence. And now, Daniel realized, they were dealing with professionals, people who knew how to cover their tracks. Ethan, Daniel said quietly, turning to the boy, did you notice anything unusual before today? Any strangers hanging around the neighborhood? Strange cars parked nearby? Ethan frowned, concentrating hard. A few days ago, I saw a black car like the one those men drove. It was parked down the street for a long time. I didn't think much of it then. But now, his voice trailed off, guilt flickering in his eyes. It's okay, Daniel reassured him quickly. You're doing great. Every detail helps. As they continued searching the house, Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just about finding Lily anymore. It was about understanding why she'd been taken. Ordinary families didn't usually attract the attention of dangerous criminals. There had to be a reason, a motive hidden beneath the surface. Was it money, revenge, or something else entirely? The weight of responsibility pressed down on Daniel. He couldn't ignore the risks involved. Taking on this case meant stepping into territory far beyond his usual legal battles. These weren't petty disputes or minor injustices. He was dealing with people who wouldn't hesitate to harm an innocent child. And yet, looking at Ethan's tear-streaked face and remembering the desperation in his voice, Daniel knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when a little girl's life depended on him. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Maria Alvarez," came the sharp reply. "Maria, it's Daniel Harper," he said, lowering his voice so Ethan wouldn't overhear. "I need your help. Something big just landed in my lap, and I can't handle it alone." Detective Maria Alvarez was an old friend from law school, though their paths had diverged over the years. She worked in the city's police department, specializing in organized crime. If anyone could help unravel this mess, it was her. "What kind of trouble are you in, Daniel?" she asked, her tone laced with curiosity. "I'll explain later," he replied. "For now, I just need you to run some checks for me. A black sedan spotted multiple times in this area recently, maybe linked to suspicious activity. Also, see if there've been any reports of similar incidents, missing kids, extortion attempts, anything." Maria hesitated for a moment. "You know I owe you one, but this better not blow back on me." "It won't," Daniel promised. "Just trust me." After hanging up, Daniel turned back to Ethan, forcing a reassuring smile. "We're going to find her, buddy. I promise." But deep down, doubts gnawed at him. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about protecting Ethan, Lily, and their mother from forces far more powerful than they could imagine. As he locked the door behind them and guided Ethan back to the car, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes were tracking their every move. The next morning, Daniel woke up early, his mind racing with the events of the previous night. He barely slept, haunted by the image of Ethan's tear-streaked face and the chilling words on that note. "If you talk, she's gone." The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, but he knew he couldn't afford to hesitate. Every second counted when it came to finding Lily. Maria called back just as Daniel was finishing his coffee. Her voice was brisk, professional, yet tinged with concern. "I ran the checks like you asked," she began without preamble. "There have been whispers about a crew operating in your area, low profile but dangerous. They're tied to a local crime syndicate involved in extortion, money laundering, and human trafficking." Daniel's stomach dropped at the last part. Human trafficking. This wasn't just about scaring a family into silence. It was far worse than he'd feared. "What else do you have?" he asked, gripping the phone tightly. "They've been targeting struggling families," Maria continued. "Folks who can't fight back, won't report them." The black sedan Ethan mentioned. It matches descriptions from other incidents. Same MO, threats, abductions, demands for compliance. But here's the kicker. These guys are connected to someone big. A real estate developer named Victor Klein. Ever heard of him? The name sent a jolt through Daniel. Victor Klein was a prominent figure in the region, known for his flashy projects and controversial business practices. On the surface, he appeared respectable, a self-made millionaire who gave generously to charities. But beneath that polished exterior lay rumors of corruption and shady dealings. If Klein was involved, this case had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. "Thanks, Maria," Daniel said, his tone grim. "I owe you one." "Be careful, Daniel," she warned before hanging up. "These people don't play nice." Armed with this new information, Daniel decided to dig deeper. He started by visiting neighbors, asking discreetly if anyone had noticed anything unusual lately. Most shrugged it off, claiming they hadn't seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. But one elderly woman, Mrs. Peterson, provided a crucial clue. "I did see those men you described," she admitted, her voice trembling. "They came around a few times, always late at night. Once, I overheard them talking about the property deal. Something about making sure no one talks. Property deal. The phrase echoed in Daniel's mind. It all made sense now, or at least, part of it did. Klein's company had been pushing aggressively to buy up land in the area, including properties owned by struggling families like Ethan's. If someone resisted or posed a threat to their plans, they eliminated the obstacle. And in this case, poor Lily had become collateral damage. That evening, Daniel met Ethan and his mother, Sarah, at their home. She was a tired-looking woman in her mid-30s, her eyes red from crying. When Daniel explained what he'd uncovered so far, her hands flew to her mouth in horror. "But we haven't done anything wrong," she exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. "Why would they take my baby?" "I don't think it's about what you've done," Daniel replied gently. "It's about what they want. Your house, your land. It's valuable to them, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." Sarah shook her head, overwhelmed. "What do we do? How do we get her back?" "We keep fighting," Daniel said firmly. "But we need to be smart. For now, stay low. Don't contact anyone except me. Let me handle this." As he left their house, Daniel felt a surge of determination mixed with dread. He was stepping into a world of shadows, where power and greed ruled unchecked. But he also knew that giving up wasn't an option, not while Lily was still out there, scared and alone. That night, as he sat at his desk poring over documents and maps, Daniel realized something else. Whoever these criminals were, they weren't just watching Ethan's family. They were watching him too. Earlier that day, he'd spotted a dark car parked outside his office, its engine idling. Coincidence? Unlikely. They were sending a message: back off, or face the consequences. But Daniel refused to be intimidated. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere out there, Lily was counting on him, and he wouldn't let her down. The following day, Daniel's sense of unease grew stronger. As he left his office, he noticed the same black car from the previous evening parked across the street. This time, it wasn't idling. It was empty. Whoever had been watching him was now lurking nearby, blending into the shadows. The message was clear. They were keeping tabs on him, waiting to see what he'd do next. Daniel tried to push the thought aside as he drove to meet Detective Maria Alvarez at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. She was already there when he arrived, sipping coffee and flipping through a folder filled with papers. Her sharp eyes met his as he slid into the booth across from her. "I don't like this, Daniel," she said without preamble. "You're poking around in places you shouldn't. These people aren't amateurs. They're dangerous. If they think you're a threat, they won't hesitate to take you out." "I know," Daniel replied grimly. "But I can't just sit back while the little girl is out there scared and alone. There has to be something we can do." Maria sighed, rubbing her temples. "Okay, listen. I've dug deeper into Victor Klein's operations. Turns out he uses remote properties, cabins, warehouses, as holding spots for hostages or assets before moving them elsewhere. One location keeps popping up in informant reports: an old hunting cabin deep in the woods about 20 miles outside of town. It's isolated, easy to guard, and hard to find unless you know where to look." Daniel's pulse quickened. That had to be where Lily was being held. "Do you have coordinates?" "A map." Maria hesitated, then handed him a folded piece of paper. "This is risky, Daniel. If you go there, you need backup." "Let me call in some officers." "No," Daniel interrupted firmly. "If we involve law enforcement officially, they'll move her. We lose our chance. I'll handle this quietly." Maria gave him a long, worried look, but didn't argue further. Instead, she handed him another sheet of paper. "Here's everything I could gather on Klein's crew. Their faces, aliases, known associates. Be careful. Some of these guys are ex-military. They're trained killers." As Daniel drove back home, his mind raced with plans. He couldn't storm the cabin alone. It was too dangerous. But he also couldn't wait. Time was running out. When he got home, he called Ethan's mother, Sarah, and asked her to stay somewhere safe until this was over. Then, after hours of preparation, he reached out to Maria again, asking her to stand by in case things went south. That night, under the cover of darkness, Daniel parked his car a mile away from the cabin and approached on foot. The forest was eerily silent, the only sounds coming from rustling leaves and distant animal calls. His heart pounded as he moved cautiously, sticking to the trees for cover. Finally, he spotted the cabin, a dilapidated structure surrounded by dense woods. Light flickered faintly through the windows, and two men stood outside, smoking and talking in hushed tones. Daniel crouched behind a tree, gripping the flashlight and pocket knife he brought with him. He knew he couldn't take on armed men directly, but he needed to get closer, to confirm Lily was inside and figure out how to get her out safely. Just as he was about to move forward, a voice crackled over one of the men's radios. "We've got movement near the south perimeter. Check it out." Daniel froze. Had they spotted him already? Heart racing, he realized he had no choice. He had to act fast. As the two guards turned toward the woods, Daniel slipped silently around the side of the cabin, praying he wouldn't be seen. Peering through a cracked window, his breath caught in his throat. There, sitting on a dusty wooden floor, was Lily. Her small frame trembled as tears streamed down her face. She looked terrified, but alive. Before Daniel could think of his next move, headlights pierced the darkness. A vehicle was approaching fast. Reinforcements. Panic surged through him. He had seconds to decide, retreat or risk everything to save her. And in that moment, Daniel chose to fight. The sound of the approaching vehicle sent a jolt of adrenaline through Daniel's body. He knew he had only moments before the reinforcements arrived, and with them, any chance of quietly rescuing Lily would vanish. His mind raced as he weighed his options. Retreat meant leaving Lily behind, and possibly losing her forever. But staying put meant risking his own life, and potentially hers, in a dangerous confrontation. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no time for hesitation. Crouching low, he moved quickly to the back of the cabin, where the wooden walls were weathered and partially rotted. With careful precision, he used the pocket knife to pry open a loose plank, creating just enough space to slip inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew. Lily sat huddled in the corner, her small hands clutching her knees tightly. Her wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto Daniel as he stepped into view. For a moment, she didn't move, frozen by fear or disbelief. Then, recognizing him, she let out a soft whimper. "Mister," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's okay, Lily," Daniel said gently, kneeling beside her. "I'm here to take you home. But we need to be very quiet, okay?" She nodded, though her lower lip quivered. Daniel scanned the room quickly, searching for anything that could help them escape unnoticed. A narrow door led to what appeared to be a storage closet, while another opened into a short hallway that likely connected to the front entrance. Voices echoed faintly from outside, the guards returning after checking the perimeter. "We don't have much time," Daniel murmured under his breath. He glanced at Lily again, his heart breaking at how fragile she looked. "Can you walk? We need to leave now." Lily nodded again, determination replacing some of the fear in her eyes. She reached out, gripping Daniel's hand tightly. Together, they crept toward the hallway, avoiding the creaky floorboards. As they neared the exit, the voices grew louder. One of the men barked orders into his radio, their words sharp and urgent. They were onto something or someone. Just as Daniel reached for the doorknob, heavy footsteps thundered onto the porch. The door flew open, revealing two armed men silhouetted against the headlights of the arriving vehicle. Daniel froze, shielding Lily behind him instinctively. For a split second, everyone stood motionless, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then chaos erupted. One of the men shouted, raising his weapon. Without thinking, Daniel shoved Lily toward the storage closet. whispering fiercely, "Stay there, no matter what." Before the men could react, he lunged forward, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it with all his strength. The wooden legs collided with one guard's arm, sending his gun clattering to the floor. The second man charged at Daniel, but he sidestepped just in time, causing the attacker to crash into the wall. Outside, more voices joined the commotion. Backup had arrived. Daniel cursed silently, realizing they were outnumbered. But then headlights swept across the clearing, followed by the unmistakable wail of police sirens. Maria had kept her promise. She'd called in reinforcements despite his earlier insistence not to involve law enforcement. The sudden arrival threw the kidnappers into disarray. Guns drawn, officers poured into the cabin, shouting commands. Daniel shielded Lily protectively as the scene unfolded around them. Within minutes, the criminals were subdued, handcuffed, and dragged away. Through it all, Lily clung to Daniel like a lifeline, her tiny frame shaking with sobs of relief. As the dust settled, Maria approached, holstering her weapon. "You're lucky I didn't listen to you this time," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Next time, maybe don't try to play hero alone." Daniel managed a tired smile, his body sagging with exhaustion. "Thanks, Maria. You saved us." But the real thanks came later, when Ethan ran into the cabin, tears streaming down his face, not of sadness this time, but of joy. He threw his arms around Lily, holding her so tightly it seemed he'd never let go. Sarah followed close behind, collapsing to her knees as she embraced both her children. Watching the reunion, Daniel felt a rare sense of fulfillment. It wasn't justice served in a courtroom. It was justice delivered in its purest form. A family reunited, safe and whole. The aftermath of the rescue felt surreal, like a storm that had finally passed, leaving behind both relief and lingering unease. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, Daniel stood outside the cabin watching as paramedics tended to Lily and Ethan. The siblings clung to each other, their tears now ones of joy rather than fear. Sarah sat nearby, her arms wrapped tightly around them, whispering words of comfort and gratitude. Detective Maria Alvarez approached Daniel, her expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You're either the bravest guy I know or the craziest," she said with a wry smile. "What you did back there, it was reckless, but it worked." Daniel shrugged, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I didn't have a choice, Maria. When you see a kid like Lily, scared, alone, you can't just walk away. You do whatever it takes." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Well, this isn't over yet. Klein's operation is bigger than we realized. Those men tonight, they're just pawns. We've got enough evidence to bring him down, but it won't be easy. He's got connections, powerful ones." Daniel frowned, knowing she was right. Victor Klein wasn't going to go quietly. But for now, at least Lily was safe, and that was what mattered most. As the sun rose higher, casting warm light over the clearing, Sarah walked up to Daniel, her eyes filled with emotion. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You saved my daughter. You saved my family. I'll never forget this." Daniel gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's my job, Sarah. And honestly, it's Ethan who deserves the credit. If he hadn't come to me, if he hadn't trusted me, we wouldn't be standing here today." Sarah glanced at Ethan, who was busy hugging Lily so tightly it seemed he'd never let go. Her lips curved into a bittersweet smile. He's always been protective of her. Even when things get tough, he tries so hard to take care of her. "And he did great," Daniel added firmly. "Both of your kids are stronger than they realize." Later that day, as the authorities took control of the scene and began processing the arrests, Daniel drove back to town. The adrenaline rush had faded, leaving him drained but oddly satisfied. For years, he'd questioned whether his work truly made a difference. Too often, justice felt hollow, A courtroom victory that changed little in the grand scheme of things. But tonight, he'd seen justice in its purest form, a family reunited, hope restored. When he arrived home, Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee and sat on his porch, letting the quietness of the morning wash over him. His phone buzzed with messages from Maria, updating him on the investigation, along with a heartfelt text from Sarah thanking him once again. As he scrolled through them, he couldn't help but think about how close they'd come to tragedy, and how much worse it could have been if Ethan hadn't run toward him that fateful evening. But there was something else weighing on his mind, the system itself. This case had exposed cracks in the foundation of their community, places where greed and corruption thrived unchecked. It reminded Daniel why he became an attorney in the first place, not just to win cases, but to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. A few days later, Daniel received a package in the mail. Inside was a drawing done in crayon, a stick figure picture of him standing beside two smiling children under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, written in shaky letters, were the words, "Thank you for saving Lily." Ethan had signed his name proudly beneath it. Daniel taped the drawing to the wall above his desk, where it would serve as a reminder, not just of the case, but of the reason he kept fighting. Life in the small town returned to its usual rhythm. Though everyone whispered about what had happened, some praised Daniel, others warned him to tread carefully. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Lily was home, Ethan could sleep peacefully again, and Sarah no longer feared for her children's safety. And as Daniel closed his office door that evening, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. Justice wasn't just about laws or courtrooms. It was about people, their courage, their resilience, and their refusal to give up even when the odds seemed impossible.